History is written by the victors, or so the saying goes. For decades, the story of World War II has been told primarily from the Allied perspective, with narratives about heroism, sacrifice, and the triumph of good over evil. These stories are important, and they deserve to be told. But there is another side to every battle, another perspective that is often overlooked or dismissed. And that is the perspective of the enemy. Understanding how your opponents saw you, how they perceived your tactics, how they reacted to your presence on the battlefield, this provides crucial insights that traditional history often misses. Today, we are going to do something unusual. We are going to examine World War II from the German perspective, specifically looking at what Wehrmacht soldiers, SS troops, and Nazi commanders thought about one particular enemy, the Canadian Armed Forces. What we discover when we dive into German war diaries, captured letters, interrogation reports, and military archives is shocking. According to the Germans themselves, Canadian soldiers were not just another Allied force. They were something far more terrifying. They were brutal, unpredictable, savage fighters who showed no mercy, who fought with a ferocity that shocked even hardened German veterans, and who developed a reputation that made Wehrmacht soldiers request transfers rather than face them in battle. This is not Allied propaganda. This is what German soldiers actually wrote in their personal diaries. This is what captured POWs told their interrogators. This is what appears in official Wehrmacht military reports and SS intelligence documents. Today, we are going to explore these primary sources, these direct testimonies from the enemy. We are going to ask difficult questions about why Canadians developed this fearsome reputation, about what tactics they employed, about whether this reputation was deserved, and about what it tells us about the nature of warfare and the thin line between military effectiveness and brutality. Before we begin, I need to be clear about something. This documentary is not about glorifying violence or celebrating war crimes. This is about understanding historical truth, about examining how combat actually functioned during World War II, and about recognizing that war brings out both the best and worst in human beings. The soldiers we honor as heroes often did things that were morally complicated, and sometimes crossed lines that make us uncomfortable. That complexity is worth exploring, because sanitized history that ignores uncomfortable truths is not real history at all. Dieppe, THE-BYRTHOFARE-PUTATION. So let us begin with a question that might seem simple, but actually has a complex answer. What made Canadian soldiers different from other Allied forces? And why did Germans perceive them as uniquely dangerous? To answer this, we need to go back to August 19, 1942, to the beaches of Dieppe, France. Canadian forces participated in one of the most disastrous operations of the entire war, a raid that would end in catastrophic failure with over 900 Canadian soldiers killed and nearly 2,000 captured. But it would also plant the seeds of a reputation that would haunt German forces for the rest of the war. The Dieppe raid was supposed to be a quick strike against the German-occupied French coast, a test of amphibious assault tactics, and a show of force to demonstrate that the Allies could strike the continent. But the operation went wrong almost immediately. German defenders were alert. The element of surprise was lost. Canadian troops landing on the beaches were met with devastating machine gun fire and artillery. They were pinned down on the beach, unable to advance, unable to retreat, being cut to pieces. From the Allied perspective, Dieppe was a disaster, a failure that cost thousands of lives and provided painful lessons about the difficulties of amphibious warfare. But from the German perspective, something very different happened. Yes, they had successfully defended the coast. Yes, they had inflicted heavy casualties on the attackers. But what shocked the German defenders was how the Canadians fought. Even when the situation was hopeless, even when they were surrounded and outgunned, even when retreat was impossible, these Canadian soldiers kept fighting with a fury and determination that German veterans found startling. There are multiple German accounts from Dieppe that describe Canadian soldiers charging German positions with bayonets, fighting hand to hand in the streets, refusing to surrender even when wounded, and showing what Germans described as fanatical bravery. One German officer wrote in his diary that night something that would prove prophetic. Today we fought Canadians, and they are not like the British. They do not fight with discipline and restraint. They fight like cornered animals, with desperation and rage. And I fear that if we meet them again under better circumstances, they will be formidable enemies. That assessment was absolutely correct. The survivors of Dieppe, the Canadian soldiers who made it back across the English Channel, carried with them a burning desire for revenge, a determination to prove that they were not the defeated force that Dieppe might suggest, and a willingness to embrace increasingly aggressive and brutal tactics in future engagements. When Canadian forces returned to continental Europe 2 years later on D-Day, they brought with them lessons learned in blood at Dieppe and a reputation that preceded them. German intelligence had been tracking Allied units, and they knew that Canadian divisions were part of the invasion force. There are documented cases of German commanders briefing their troops specifically about the Canadian reputation, warning them that these were not soldiers who would accept surrender easily, and advising them to fight to the death rather than be captured by Canadians. This kind of pre-battle warning is extremely unusual. Typically, German briefings focused on tactical situations, terrain, and strategic objectives. But when Canadians were involved, there was an additional psychological component, a recognition that fighting Canadians was different. Germen Dieries, The Landjuagofer. So what exactly did German soldiers write about Canadians in their diaries and letters? What do these primary sources reveal about the enemy's perspective? This is where the historical record becomes both fascinating and disturbing. When you read through collections of German soldiers' personal writings that have been translated and archived, you find recurring themes, repeated phrases, consistent observations that paint a very specific picture. The most common descriptors that appear are words like brutal, merciless, savage, unpredictable, and terrifying. These are not words that German soldiers typically used to describe British or American forces. They had respect for those opponents, certainly, but the language was different, more professional, more matter of fact. But when writing about Canadians, there is an emotional quality to the German accounts. There is fear. One Wehrmacht soldier writing from Normandy in July 1944 described an encounter with Canadian troops. "We have been fighting for 3 days against a Canadian division, and the fighting is unlike anything I experienced in Russia. The Canadians do not take prisoners. They do not accept surrender. They attack at night without warning. They appear from nowhere and disappear like ghosts. And when they capture our positions, we find our men with their throats cut, This is not warfare as we know it. This is something more primitive, more savage. And the men are becoming demoralized because they know that if the Canadians attack, there is no option of surrender. There is only fighting to the death or dying anyway. This account is not unique. There are dozens of similar testimonies in German military archives describing Canadian tactics as outside the normal rules of warfare, as crossing lines that other Allied forces respected. But we need to be careful here. We need to ask critical questions about these accounts. Were Canadians actually more brutal than other Allied forces? Or were Germans perceiving them that way for specific reasons? This is where historical analysis becomes complex. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Yes, there is substantial evidence that Canadian forces did employ particularly aggressive tactics, including night raids, targeting of officers, refusal to take prisoners in certain situations, and a general approach to combat that prioritized killing the enemy over capturing them. But it is also true that German soldiers may have exaggerated Canadian brutality, either consciously as propaganda, or unconsciously as a way of explaining their own defeats. Psychologically, it is easier to accept losing to a savage, inhuman enemy than to admit that you were simply outfought by regular soldiers. So we have to read these German accounts with some skepticism, while also acknowledging that the sheer volume and consistency of these reports suggests that there was real substance to the reputation. The Dieppe EFFECT CLTUR, OFRA EVNGE, there is also a strategic reason why Canadians may have adopted more aggressive tactics, and that reason is Dieppe. After the disaster of the Dieppe raid, there was a widespread feeling among Canadian forces that they had been sacrificed in a poorly planned operation, that British commanders had sent them into a meat grinder, and that the resulting casualties were not just a military failure, but a betrayal. This created a culture within Canadian units of not wanting to be victims again, of taking control of situations through overwhelming aggression, of making the enemy more afraid of them than they were of the enemy. There are accounts of Canadian officers explicitly encouraging this mindset, telling their men that the best defense is a terrifying offense, and that the way to survive is to make the Germans too scared to fight effectively. Whether this was official policy or informal culture, the result was the same. Canadian units developed a reputation for extreme aggressiveness. In IGHT Raedesin Tichi Tarawar OF Darknesses, one particular aspect of Canadian tactics that Germans found especially terrifying was night raids. While most forces conducted operations during daylight when visibility was good and coordination was easier, Canadian units became specialists in nighttime attacks, infiltrating German lines under cover of darkness, eliminating sentries silently, using knives and bayonets rather than guns to avoid raising alarms, then attacking sleeping troops or destroying supplies, or capturing prisoners before disappearing back into the night. German soldiers absolutely hated this. It meant they could never relax, could never feel safe, even in supposedly secure rear areas, could never sleep soundly, because at any moment Canadians might appear out of the darkness. A German soldier stationed in Normandy wrote in a letter to his family, "I have not slept properly in 2 weeks, because the Canadians attack at night. You do not hear them coming. You do not see them until it is too late. Yesterday they came into our camp and killed 8 men while they slept, and we did not even know they were there until morning when we found the bodies." The commander says we need better sentries. But how can sentries stop ghosts? This kind of psychological warfare was incredibly effective. Even when Canadian raids did not cause massive casualties, they caused exhaustion, fear, and demoralization. Teach ter gitid ss sinet ion. Personnel, JS to C. There is a particularly famous incident that appears in multiple German accounts about a Canadian unit that conducted a raid specifically targeting a German officer known for his brutality toward French civilians. The Canadians infiltrated the German headquarters at night, bypassed all the guards, went directly to the officer's quarters, and killed him in his sleep. Then they left a note on his body that said in German, "This is what happens to those who harm innocents." And then they vanished. When German soldiers found the body in the morning, along with the note, the psychological impact was devastating. It demonstrated that nowhere was safe, that even high-ranking officers in supposedly secure locations could be reached, and that the Canadians were not just fighting a military war. They were delivering personal justice. Whether this story is entirely true or has been embellished over time, it appears in enough German sources that something like it almost certainly happened. And it became part of the legend that surrounded Canadian forces. Tici Preisenanar QSTON FFTOR fear. But the German fear of Canadians was not just about night raids or aggressive tactics. It was also about a perception that Canadians did not follow the same rules of warfare that other Allied forces observed. Specifically, there was a widespread belief among German soldiers that Canadians did not take prisoners, or that they executed prisoners after capture. This is an extremely serious accusation. If true, it would constitute war crimes. We need to examine this claim carefully. The historical evidence is complicated. On one hand, there are multiple documented cases of Canadian soldiers shooting German prisoners, particularly in the immediate aftermath of intense combat. There are testimonies from both Canadian veterans and German PNUs that confirm this happened. On the other hand, every army in World War II, including the Germans, committed similar acts. The idea that Canadians were uniquely guilty of prisoner abuse is not supported by comparative evidence. But what may be true is that Canadians were less concerned with hiding these incidents, and that their reputation for prisoner mistreatment became so widespread that it served as a form of psychological warfare, even if the reality was not dramatically different from other forces. Reisi Piarokel Burulizion, THCYCLE, Of Violencie. There is a concept in military psychology called reciprocal brutalization, which describes how violence in warfare tends to escalate as each side responds to perceived atrocities by the other with increased brutality. This dynamic definitely occurred between German and Canadian forces. Germans would point to Canadian mistreatment of prisoners as justification for their own harsh tactics. Canadians would point to German atrocities against civilians and POBs as justification for their refusal to show mercy. This created a vicious cycle where combat between these two forces became increasingly savage, and where the normal restraints that sometimes limited violence in warfare between other combatants broke down completely. German soldiers recognized this. There are accounts of Wehrmacht units specifically requesting to be transferred away from sectors facing Canadian divisions because they knew that fighting Canadians meant higher casualty rates, more brutal combat, and less chance of surviving if captured. Grmayan intlIGNCE assessment instudionel resiogmioen. One particularly revealing document comes from German military intelligence archives. It is a report dated August 1944, analyzing Allied forces and their combat effectiveness. In this report, Canadian divisions are rated as among the most dangerous opponents that German forces face. The report specifically notes, Canadian units demonstrate exceptional aggression in attack situations, show high morale despite heavy casualties, employ irregular tactics including night infiltration and targeted assassination, and have developed a reputation that negatively impacts German soldier morale. When facing them, combat becomes attritional and brutal, with high casualties on both sides, and surrender rates are low because neither side expects quarter. This kind of clinical assessment from German high command shows that the fear of Canadians was not just individual soldiers being scared, but was a recognized institutional concern that German military planners had to account for when allocating forces and planning defensive operations. THEITLIMPIGN compare ATIV and LYSIS. The Italian campaign provides another perspective on German views of Canadian forces. Canadian troops fought extensively in Italy from 1943 through 1945, battling through some of the most difficult terrain of the entire war. German defenders in Italy, including many experienced veterans who had fought on the Eastern Front, consistently rated Canadian divisions as among the toughest opponents they faced. There is a particularly interesting account from a German officer who had commanded troops fighting against Soviets in Russia, against Americans and British in North Africa, and who then faced Canadians in Italy. He wrote a comparative analysis. The Russians fight with numbers and desperation. The Americans fight with technology and firepower. The British fight with discipline and coordination. But the Canadians fight with personal intensity, as if each soldier has a personal reason to kill you. This makes them uniquely dangerous, because they combine the tactical sophistication of British training with an individual aggressiveness that is more characteristic of Russian soldiers. And when they attack, they do not stop. They do not withdraw. They keep coming until either they break through or they are all dead. Tektilimphov sation. UNPR edihiti abelys awu ipon. This combination of tactical skill and personal ferocity is what made Canadians particularly effective in close quarters combat and urban warfare. In these environments, individual initiative and aggression matter more than large-scale coordination and firepower. Canadian soldiers, many of whom came from rural backgrounds and had experience with hunting and outdoor survival, were naturally skilled at the kind of small, unit tactics that dominated close combat. German soldiers, who were used to more structured, regimented approaches to warfare, found Canadian flexibility and improvisation difficult to counter. You could not predict what Canadians would do. They did not follow the standard tactical playbook. They adapted to situations in unexpected ways. This unpredictability created additional fear, because Germans facing Canadian units could never be sure what would happen next. Natii omed L. Chihrasdr. Some hntoprov. There is also the question of national character, and whether there was something about Canadian identity or culture that contributed to their battlefield reputation. This is speculative, because attributing military behavior to national characteristics is always risky. But it is worth noting that many German accounts specifically mention that Canadians seem to fight with a chip on their shoulder, as if they had something to prove. This makes historical sense. Canada in World War II was still very much in Britain's shadow, still proving itself as an independent nation, still seeking recognition and respect on the world stage. Canadian soldiers were aware that they were often overlooked in favor of British and American forces. There may have been a collective determination to prove that Canadians were just as capable, just as brave, just as effective as any other Allied force. That determination manifested as exceptional aggressiveness in combat, as a refusal to accept defeat or retreat, and as a willingness to take risks and embrace brutal tactics that would make their reputation undeniable. PROPGND-AND-CLF, FUFELINGPRPHECY German propaganda also played a role in shaping perceptions of Canadian forces. Nazi propagandists found it useful to portray certain Allied units as savage or criminal, both to justify German brutality in response and to prepare German soldiers psychologically for difficult combat. There are propaganda posters and radio broadcasts from the period that specifically warn about Canadian terror troops and describe them as criminals and barbarians. While this was obviously exaggerated for propaganda purposes, it had the interesting effect of reinforcing the very reputation that Canadians had cultivated. German soldiers who had been told to expect savage fighters would interpret any aggressive Canadian tactics as confirmation of the propaganda and would fight with greater desperation, which in turn would provoke even more aggressive Canadian responses, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. The reali ty now tglor, but we should not romanticize or glorify this reputation. The reality of what we are discussing is horrific. We are talking about young men killing each other in brutal close quarters combat. We are talking about potential war crimes, including execution of prisoners. We are talking about psychological trauma that affected survivors for the rest of their lives. We are talking about a cycle of violence that escalated beyond any reasonable military necessity. When German soldiers wrote about fearing Canadians, what they were really expressing was fear of dying in terrible ways, fear of being killed in their sleep, fear of being wounded and left to die, fear of capture and execution. These are entirely reasonable fears because war, especially the kind of intense combat that characterized fighting in Normandy and Italy, was genuinely horrific. Both sides committed acts that under any other circumstances would be considered murder. Apollos testai moes, rai elati vs. Ariptetadium. There is a testimony from a German PW who was captured by Canadian forces in 1944 and interviewed by Allied intelligence officers. In that interview, he described his experience. When we heard that Canadians were in our sector, we knew it would be bad, because everyone had heard the stories about what Canadians did to prisoners. When they overran our position, I thought I would be killed immediately. But instead they took me and several others captive and marched us to a collection point. Along the way I saw many dead German soldiers, and some of them had clearly been killed after surrendering because their hands were still raised. I was certain that I would also be executed. But instead they gave me water and food and treated me according to the Geneva Convention, and I realized that the reality was more complicated than the reputation. This testimony is valuable because it shows that the German fear of Canadians was partly based on real incidents, but was also amplified by rumor and psychological warfare. Canadian forces were not uniformly brutal, but rather varied depending on unit leadership, individual soldiers, and specific combat situations. Militar EFFETIVNS THEDOBLEEDGDSTORD. This brings us to one of the most important questions we need to ask. Was the Canadian reputation for brutality a good thing from a military effectiveness standpoint? The answer is genuinely complicated. On one hand, there is no question that fear is a weapon. German soldiers who were terrified of facing Canadians were less effective in combat, were more likely to retreat or surrender prematurely, and were generally demoralized. From a purely tactical perspective, the psychological impact of the Canadian reputation saved Allied lives, because Germans who were afraid to fight effectively meant fewer casualties for Canadian units and faster operational success. But on the other hand, reputation-based warfare creates expectations and pressures that can lead to escalating violence. Once you have a reputation for being merciless, you have to maintain that reputation, which means continuing to employ brutal tactics, even when they might not be necessary. This creates a moral hazard, where violence becomes performative, becomes about maintaining image rather than achieving military objectives. That is a dangerous dynamic. Tici debu anxiety. DS per 80, resus eshti and CE. There are also accounts of German units fighting with greater desperation against Canadians because they believed surrender was not an option. This actually increased Canadian casualties in some situations because Germans who might have surrendered to British or American forces instead fought to the death when facing Canadians. There are multiple documented cases of this, including a battle in Normandy where a German unit refused repeated surrender demands and continued fighting from a fortified position until they were completely wiped out. Captured documents from that unit showed that the commander had told his men that the Canadians would execute them if they surrendered, so they might as well die fighting. Whether that belief was accurate or not, it had real consequences. It prolonged the battle and increased casualties on both sides, and demonstrated that reputation can be a double-edged sword. THE-NATHRLANs. Liberato ars and wario ars. As the war progressed and Canadian forces moved from France into the Netherlands, the dynamic shifted somewhat. In the Netherlands, Canadians were liberators, saving Dutch civilians from Nazi occupation. The Dutch people welcomed them as heroes. This created a different psychological context, where Canadian soldiers were fighting not just to defeat Germany, but to free an oppressed population. German soldiers fighting in the Netherlands were aware of this. There are accounts describing how German morale collapsed in Dutch sectors because they knew they were on the wrong side of history, knew that the local population supported the Canadians, and knew that defeat was inevitable. In this context, the Canadian reputation for aggressiveness became even more demoralizing for German forces because they were not just losing militarily, they were losing morally and psychologically. The combination was devastating. AO Ewing Seldi, IERS REL IEF, there is a particularly poignant account from a young German soldier who was captured by Canadian forces during the liberation of the Netherlands. In his interrogation, he said something striking. "I am glad it was Canadians who captured me, because even though I have heard terrible things about what they do to prisoners, I have also heard that they treat civilians well, and that they are here to liberate, not to conquer. I would rather be a prisoner of soldiers who fight for liberation than continue fighting for a cause that I no longer believe in." This testimony reveals something important. German soldiers were not monolithic. Some believed in Nazi ideology and fought fanatically. but many others, especially by late 1944 and 1945, were disillusioned, exhausted, and looking for a way out. The Canadian reputation cut both ways. It terrified those who wanted to keep fighting, but it also provided a kind of permission structure for those who wanted to surrender, because surrendering to a fierce enemy was less shameful than surrendering to a weak one. The wars end, a camplex ligisiwa by the time the war ended in May 1945. Canadian forces had participated in some of the most important operations of the entire conflict, including D-Day, the liberation of France, the Italian campaign, the Scheldt battles, and the final push into Germany. They had earned a reputation as elite assault troops, as soldiers who could be counted on to take difficult objectives and to fight with exceptional determination. This reputation was built on real military effectiveness, on tactical skill, on bravery, and on sacrifice. But it was also built on a calculated use of psychological warfare, on a willingness to embrace brutal tactics, and on a dynamic of reciprocal violence that escalated throughout the war. German soldiers who faced them recognized all of this. Their accounts provide a perspective that complicates our understanding of Canadian military history, because it is easy to celebrate Canadian achievements and to honor the sacrifice of those who served, but it is more difficult to grapple with the moral complexity of how those achievements were accomplished. Veteranes, strggles, the morel cosity. After the war, many Canadian veterans struggled with what they had done and seen. The brutal tactics that made them effective on the battlefield also created psychological trauma and moral injury. There are accounts of veterans who returned home and could not reconcile the person they had become during the war with the person they wanted to be in peace. Some became advocates for peace and reconciliation, specifically because they had experienced the horror of combat brutality firsthand and did not want future generations to experience the same. Others simply never spoke about their experiences, locked away the memories, and tried to move on. This silence has contributed to a sanitized public memory of Canadian involvement in World War II, where we celebrate the victories and honor the sacrifice, but rarely discuss the uncomfortable details about how warfare actually functioned. KOFRONTINGUNCOMFRTBLE, the historical record of what Germans thought about Canadians is valuable precisely because it forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths. When we read German accounts describing Canadian brutality, we cannot simply dismiss them as enemy propaganda, because too many of them are corroborated by Canadian sources, by documented incidents, by patterns of behavior that appear across multiple units and time periods. So we have to acknowledge that yes, Canadian forces were exceptionally effective. Yes, they developed a fearsome reputation. And yes, that reputation was at least partially based on tactical approaches that crossed ethical lines. All of these things can be true simultaneously because human beings and human institutions are complex, capable of both heroism and cruelty often in the same moment. Lessos L.E. Mel Tiple Pierce PTVS. What should we take away from this examination of German perspectives on Canadian forces? I think there are several important lessons. First, we learn that history looks very different depending on whose perspective you adopt. Understanding how your enemies perceived you provides crucial context that you cannot get from only studying your own side. Second, we learn that military effectiveness and moral behavior are not always aligned. Soldiers can be both heroes who saved the world from fascism and individuals who committed acts that we would condemn in any other context. Third, we learn that reputation and psychological warfare are powerful weapons. Fear can be as effective as firepower. The stories we tell about ourselves and our enemies shape behavior in profound ways. Fourth, we learn that we need to be honest about the costs of war, not just the costs in lives and resources, but the moral costs, the trauma, the brutalization, the way that combat changes people and creates dynamics of violence that are difficult to control. EMPHYANDNUANCE. And finally, we learn that the soldiers who fought in World War II, including Canadian soldiers, were human beings facing impossible situations, making difficult choices under unimaginable stress. Judging them from the comfort of the present, with the benefit of hindsight, is easy, but understanding them requires empathy and nuance and a willingness to sit with moral complexity. This does not mean excusing war crimes or celebrating brutality, but it does mean recognizing that warfare, especially total war against an enemy as evil as Nazi Germany, creates conditions where normal moral reasoning breaks down, where survival instincts override ethical considerations, and where good people sometimes do terrible things. We honor their service and their sacrifice, most fully not by sanitizing their story, but by telling it truthfully, with all its contradictions and complications. Final ANSWR INCHGR mans, Fiard, so when we ask what Germans feared about Canadians, the answer is that they feared soldiers who fought with exceptional skill and determination, who employed psychological warfare effectively, who had cultivated a reputation for brutality that may or may not have been fully deserved, but which was definitely effective, and who represented something that German forces increasingly encountered as the war turned against them. An enemy who was not afraid, who would not be intimidated, and who would keep fighting no matter what. That is a terrifying opponent to face. The fact that Canadian forces became that kind of opponent through a combination of tactical innovation, national determination, response to earlier defeats, and calculated use of fear as a weapon tells us something important about military effectiveness, about human psychology, and about the complex nature of warfare that textbooks and patriotic narratives often leave out. CLOSING RAIMARKS. Thank you for watching this documentary on German perspectives about Canadian forces in World War II. I know this has been a difficult and complex topic because we have discussed brutality, war crimes, moral ambiguity, and challenged some comfortable narratives about heroism and honor. But I believe this kind of honest historical examination is valuable because it helps us understand the real nature of warfare, helps us appreciate the sacrifices made by those who served, and helps us think more clearly about modern conflicts and the choices we face today. If you found this documentary thought-provoking, I want to ask you to do several things, because this channel depends on your support and engagement to continue creating in-depth historical content like this. Saelto Action. First, please hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon so you are notified whenever we release new documentaries. We are committed to telling untold stories, exploring uncomfortable truths, and examining history from multiple perspectives. We release new content every week covering World War II military history, strategic analysis, and deep dives into specific battles, units, and historical controversies. Subscribing is free, and it helps the algorithm show our content to more people who appreciate serious historical analysis. Second, please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts about this documentary. I want to know what you think about the moral questions we raised, about whether you believe Canadian tactics were justified, about what you would have done in similar circumstances, about how we should remember and honor soldiers who fought in morally complex situations. I read every comment, and your feedback helps shape future content and creates a community of people interested in honest historical discussion. Some of the best insights and perspectives come from the comment section, so please contribute your thoughts. Third, if you found this documentary valuable, please hit the like button. It seems like a small thing, but it actually matters a lot for how the platform promotes content. Every like helps this video reach more people, helps the algorithm understand that this is quality content that viewers appreciate, and helps support growth. So if you watched this far and found value in this documentary, please take 2 seconds to click that thumbs up button. Fourth, please share this video with anyone you know who is interested in World War II history, military history, Canadian history, or just thoughtful analysis of complex topics. The best way to grow is through word of mouth, through viewers like you sharing content with friends, family, colleagues, and online communities. If you are part of any history forums, groups, or servers where people discuss military history, please consider sharing this video there, because finding audiences who appreciate in depth serious historical content is challenging, and your help makes a huge difference. Fifth, if you really want to support this channel and help us create even better content, please consider becoming a channel member or supporting us through crowdfunding. Creating these documentaries requires significant research, time, and effort because we rely on primary sources. We fact-check everything, we try to provide nuanced analysis, and we are committed to historical accuracy and depth. Member support allows us to invest more time in research, to access premium historical archives, to improve production quality, and to create more ambitious projects. Members also get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes content, and input on future topics. So if you value what we do here, please consider supporting financially. HTS, and finally, I want to remind everyone that this documentary was not created to glorify violence or to celebrate war crimes, but rather to explore historical truth in all its complexity. I believe that we honor veterans most fully by telling their stories honestly, by acknowledging both their heroism and their humanity, by recognizing that war creates impossible situations where good people are forced to make terrible choices, and by learning from history so that we can hopefully make better decisions in the future. If you are a veteran or the family member of a veteran, please know that this documentary was created with deep respect for the service and sacrifice of all who fought in World War II, regardless of nationality. If anything in this documentary was painful or triggering, I apologize. I want you to know that the intention was always to educate and to promote understanding, not to cause harm. For those of you interested in learning more about this topic, I have included a list of recommended books and academic sources in the description below, including collections of German soldier, diaries and letters, academic studies of Canadian military tactics in World War II, and analyses of psychological warfare and combat brutality. This documentary only scratches the surface of a complex topic, and there is so much more to learn for those who want to dive deeper. I encourage you to seek out these sources, to read broadly, to consider multiple perspectives, and to form your own conclusions about these difficult historical questions. Once again, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for engaging with serious historical content. Thank you for thinking critically about complex topics. And thank you for supporting this channel through subscriptions, likes, comments, and shares, because none of this would be possible without viewers like you. I will see you in the next documentary, where we will continue exploring the untold stories, the uncomfortable truths, and the fascinating complexities of military history. Until then, please take care. Remember that history is complicated, and keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeking truth, even when it challenges your assumptions, because that is how we truly honor the past and build a better future.